Bismillah, alhamdulillah, as-salatu was-salam ala rasulillah. A lot of people claim that different ideologies are compatible with Islam. They'll say that, for example, social justice activism is compatible with Islam, or feminism, or even veganism, vegetarianism. All of these claims are made in this day and age where Muslims are trying to hitch their wagon to the trendy or popular ideology that's in vogue today. But how do we evaluate these claims? How can we really understand if these ideologies are truly compatible with Islam? What we need to do is understand the difference between usul and furu'. Usul and furu'. So what do these terms mean? So every ideology has this basic structure. And it doesn't have to be an ideology, it can be even religion, it can be a philosophy, but they all share this basic structure of having core principles, usul, and then furu', branching issues, which are secondary or tertiary beliefs or positions. And so you can imagine a tree, and the tree has a trunk, and that represents the usul, and then you have branches that branch out, and those are the furu'. So we can understand all ideologies in that way. So how do we compare two ideologies? Well, if you do a comparison and just look at the furu', if you just look at the branch issues, you can find a lot of compatibility. You can find a lot of compatibility between two ideologies when it comes to these secondary and tertiary issues that are found in the branches. But what about the usul? To really be able to compare two ideologies, you have to see what are the core principles that are at the center of these different ideologies. And so you can, again, diagram this with two trees. You have, for example, Islam and social justice activism, okay? There's very clearly areas where the two overlap, right? There are issues where both Islam and modern day social justice activism align very clearly when it comes to, for example, police brutality or the criminal injustice system that seems to systematically prey on certain demographics, blacks, Hispanics, and other minority groups. This is something that we as Muslims need to speak out about because it's clear injustice. And again, this is an area where the furu', when it comes to this issue, there's alignment and there's overlap. But what about the usul? What about the usul of social justice activism? And that's where we find problems and dissimilarities. And when it comes to social justice in particular, part of this usul is, for example, equal rights regardless of what's considered sexual orientation, right? Equal rights regardless of sexual orientation. So based on that asl, there's this idea that to be a social justice activist, you have to promote same-sex marriage, right? And so this is something that is contradictory to Islamic principles, and we would never be able to reach that position through Islamic usul, okay? And this is very obvious because if we look at Islamic history and we look at usul al-fiqh, we look at usul al-din, we look at what scholars have said in the past and present on this issue, same-sex marriage is not something that could ever be sanctioned within an Islamic framework or reached through Islamic usul. Okay, and so this is a much larger discussion, but what I want to drive home is this idea of these two trees, okay? And you have some overlap on some branches, but some other branches just cannot be reached through the Islamic usul. And so that's what we have to do to really understand the compatibility or incompatibility between two ideologies, is to not get distracted by the similarity in certain furu', but actually consider the usul, consider the tree trunks. So another example that we can consider is from the past. There used to be Muslims in the past who claimed that Islam is essentially communist, and Islam is a communist religion. And again, we see the same pattern of focusing on the branches and ignoring the trunk. And so these communist Muslims would say that, well, doesn't Islam encourage us to be charitable in terms of sadaqah, in terms of zakat? So they analogized those concepts, which are clearly a part of Islam, and said that, okay, well, this is very similar to what communism calls us to in terms of setting up a communist state, an anti-capitalist state. So you find this same pattern. Look at feminist Islam. Okay, yeah, there's very clearly overlaps when it comes to respecting women, treating women well. These are things that Islam endorses and acknowledges and champions. But there are other issues that are very obviously un-Islamic, anti-Islamic, and they stem from difference in usul, right? Because we're looking at two completely different trees, right? Two completely different trees. So a good example is recently there was a Muslim woman in India who thought that she could lead men in prayer. So she led Friday prayer for a bunch of these confused Muslims. And what she claimed was that Islam has equal roles for men and women. Therefore, it should be valid for a woman to lead Friday prayers and to be in that role of an imam. Okay, so this is an example. She took the idea of equality in role in religion as part of the asl, as part of the usul of Islam. Okay, but that's a mistake. That's purely a principle from a feminist paradigm or feminist mindset that has been conflated with Islamic usul. And so again, think of the tree. The only way that you can get to this position, this branch of a woman being an imam, a woman leading men in prayer, a woman leading Friday prayer, the only way to get to that is from the feminist feminist tree, from that direction. Okay, so this is why it's so dangerous to conflate the usul of two different ideologies and claim that Islam is feminist, communist, in line with social justice, ideology and activism. It leads to this kind of confusion and conflation. And you have Muslims who otherwise are very orthodox and traditional, and they start endorsing these positionings that are very un-Islamic. So how do they get to that state? It's because they've started out by mistaking the usul of these other ideologies and thinking that they're Islamic, and then deriving these positions that, again, are so far removed from the Islamic religion. So this is why we have to be very, very careful. We have to be extremely careful about how we talk about Islam and how we say Islam is compatible or incompatible with different ideologies. To be safe, we should avoid it entirely. There's no need to admix and conflate these modern ideologies and try to make this kind of very anachronistic argument that Islam is actually compatible with some ideology that has just been invented or thought up in the last 100 years. Okay, our deen is 1400 years old. It doesn't need these additions, or it doesn't need the endorsements of these kinds of other philosophies and ideologies. And so it's best to avoid this confusion and this conflation, and we need to be actually proactive in telling people, look, don't say that Islam is X or Y ideology or compatible with these ideologies, because that leads to confusion. And if I, just think about all the Muslims who get really, gung-ho and really into these different movements. And this is not something new. We've seen it throughout history, even in the past, when it came to Greek philosophy, for example. That became a fitna. That Greek philosophy was a fitna for the community. And a lot of Muslims were led astray, and they were led into innovation because they took that ideology and that system of thought too seriously, and they thought that, yes, this is Islam. And what they were doing, again, is the same pattern, focusing on the branches and ignoring the usul. Because if you did an actual comparison of the usul, you'd see, and an honest comparison, you'd see the vast conflict and discrepancy. And then that should tell you that, look, there is incompatibilities here, some important incompatibilities. So why would we want to introduce those kinds of confusions into our understanding of the deen of Allah? Okay, so this is something that we have to avoid and be very cautious about. That doesn't mean we can't learn, okay, from other ideologies, in the sense that as the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, wisdom is the lost property of the believer. So if a believer finds wisdom, he has a right to it. Okay? So this is a clear principle. But again, wisdom is a part of Islam. Islam is complete and total. And so things that we find that are truly based on our own usul, based on Islamic core principles, we judge are compatible and acceptable to Islam, then yeah, no problem. But that's not what happens when people accept these other ideologies wholesale, and they think that, yeah, well, these are principles that we need to adopt. And therefore their whole paradigm changes, their whole mindset changes, in that they then judge Islam and they start looking at Islam through the lens of these usul that are foreign to Islam. And that's how you get Muslims who think that women can lead prayer, or Muslims who think that Islam is a communist religion, Muslims who think that Islam endorses same-sex marriage and same-sex behavior. You even have Muslims who think that Islam is inherently vegan, and therefore they reject the idea of eating meat. They reject the clear sunnah of eating meat. They reject udhiyah. They reject Haqiqah for newborn children. So they reject anything that has to do with eating meat or sacrificing. And so this is leading Muslims astray. Many, many examples of this. And we have to be very cautious and concerned about how we portray the deen and how our youth are thinking about Islam. And if we go back to this principle of comparing usul and not being distracted by the furu', that I think is a very helpful device for navigating these questions. So I hope that you agree. If you do, feel free to say so in the comments. If you don't agree, feel free to say so in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you want me to address a specific topic, feel free to say so in the comments as well. And I'll hopefully be speaking to you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.